Okay. The first part was review anyway. Whoever just joined us on YouTube, I apologize. I turned the recording on a couple of minutes late. But everything we just talked about was at the tail end of last week. So there you go. Didn't have to listen to it twice. And welcome if you're joining us on YouTube or streaming, whatever. Okay. So it turns out that the evidence which was supposed to be, evolution right under our noses, caught in action, even in a short period of time, turns out to actually contradict macroevolution instead. There is no lasting accumulating change which could give rise to something different. There is no actual new feature. There's just, as one, and this was an evolutionist, the author who figured out some of this, he said those beak sizes, etc., they don't change over time. They just kind of wobble about an average, which doesn't change. No new species, no accumulating change. So that really brings us then to what I call the last category here. If evolution is true, there should be a rational, convincing mechanism for it. And you may say, well, there is. It's random mutations over time, which eventually give rise to useful new things and more complexity. Well, that's kind of vague, though. And the idea is, well, so you say, okay, what are these mutations? Well, whichever ones needed to happen. That's the ones that happened, and they got selected. Okay, I'm not making fun of the theory. Again, I give credence to that. There could be some logic to that. It's just that it doesn't turn out to be supported by the evidence, as we've seen. But there's no specific mechanism. It never gets to a convincing level. If I tell you that I have come up with a new treatment for the common cold that's going to shorten it, you're going to want to see maybe two things, but at least one of them. You're going to want me to explain exactly how does this work, okay? Or at least to a pretty good degree, what can we know, what receptor on the cell does this drug bind to, etc., okay? That's what you see with these things. How does that work? It shuts down this enzyme or whatever. You get the picture. You want to see some kind of a mechanism for that. Or at the very least, there are things we still don't, nobody still knows how general anesthesia works. Good move, Tyler. All contained, actually not bad. Okay. But we still, nobody knows to this day exactly how general anesthesia works. Okay. But we know precisely how to use it. We have the evidence, and I can tell you, we know exactly if you give somebody this much of it, they will be asleep, and if you give them this much of it, they will be dead in a few minutes, and we know exactly what those numbers are, okay? We have the evidence clear, beyond any doubt. So, and a lot of times we have both, the mechanism and the evidence. So there ought to be some rational, convincing mechanisms like, okay, if that's how it happened, I don't like magic thinking. I don't just like, well, whatever needed to happen, it just happened, billions and billions of times, etc. Show me something, all right? A well-founded hypothesis, certainly a major theory like this, if we're going to depend on to say, hey, this is how we got here and it didn't happen because of a designer, there should be some really, really good things there to support it. And certainly there can't be any theory killing things. There can't be any fatal flaws, kind of like we talked about last week. So you got to have at least a good show of one, and you can't have any of the fatal flaws. Here's a problem with evolutionary theory. We're missing the rational, convincing support for it, and yet, as we've already seen, we've got a number of truly fatal flaws, not just one. Any one would kill it, but we've got a number of them, but it still continues to be very widely accepted, not because the evidence supports it, not because it looks rational, but because, well, it could happen, and we're not going to consider anything else. That's kind of what you got going on with a lot of this thought, okay? So I think what we've seen so far, that the evidence shows that this mechanism of natural selection, which does happen, that does work, from beneficial mutations, which we don't see, we looked at that last week, doesn't happen. Natural selection could work if you could give it all of these great things to select from. But you got to have something to pick from, to select from. And that's what we don't have. And this theory then further falls apart when we look at the greater complexity. We haven't even come to this yet, but think about this. there's a big difference between a bacteria and you. Now, as I said, there is no simple life on this planet. We figured that out when DNA and electron microscopes came along. There's no such thing as simple life. However, there's a huge, huge difference between a bacteria or an amoeba or whatever and you. Now, some days I kind of feel like I might have about the brain power of an amoeba. Other days I do better. But there's a big difference. Big difference. So you got a whole lot more to explain. And I'm going to skip over a whole bunch of stuff because, as I said, we absolutely will finish today, no matter what we have to cut out. But here's what I'm talking about. There is no rational mechanism, not even a proposed one, much less demonstrated, not even proposed, for the addition of genetic material. The bacteria that you've heard an awful lot about, E. coli, okay? It's a good thing in very small amounts. You get too much of it, then you may be communing with the porcelain god, etc. So, you know, when they recall the whatever salad or chicken or whatever, yeah, don't go buy it, etc. All right, but E. coli is a bacteria that we know quite a bit about, and it's very, very useful with some smart people to actually produce some human medicines. Anyway, we know a lot about this bacteria. Okay, it has one chromosome. It has kind of one circular chromosome in it, which has about 3,000 genes on that one chromosome. That's pretty good for a little bacteria, isn't it? Simple life, 3,000 genes, all right? And 4 million DNA base pairs, all right? Well, I think that's pretty incredible. A human has 46 chromosomes, as you know. And unbelievably, most of the human genome has, now been worked out, a lot of it anyway, with 20 to 25,000 genes and 3 billion base pairs. How do you get from one to the other? See what I mean? It's not just a matter of let's mutate this gene and make it better. How do you get between 3,000 and 25,000? How do you get from 4 million to 3 billion addition of genetic material? Does that make sense? Not only getting the right material, how do you get extra material? You probably know that when you add genetic material, and it happens accidentally occasionally, it's usually not a good thing. Again, like most mutations, not a good thing. Trisomy, you've heard of trisomy 13 or trisomy 21. You've heard of things like Down syndrome and others. There are actually, Down syndrome is one of the mildest of the syndromes or diseases or conditions you can get when you add genetic material. My ex-fiance had a sister who had a I think it was a trisomy, I believe 21, if I recall. She did survive to young adulthood. She was only predicted to survive to about age 2. She had the mental ability of about a 1-month-old. Okay, that's what adding genetic material usually does. It's usually not helpful, kind of like random mutations. Okay, but the typical explanation for this is, well, okay, one of those bacteria, it reproduced, and instead of having 1 chromosome, it wound up with 2, but it was okay with that. And so then they both started mutating differently, very beneficially, and then later on it picked up another one by the same accident, but it was okay, and in fact it was good, and it started mutating. Do you see that point? And finally, there were 46 of them, and they got lots bigger because they kept accidentally adding genetic material, but it was all good, at least the ones that survived. Yeah, it's vague and it's contrary to known science. I'll just tell you quickly, there's a whole lot of stuff that there's no reasonable explanation for. And I'm just going to move very quickly here and just throw you out a few of them. Sexual reproduction in both plants and animals, especially in animals, it's quite successful. There are about 7 billion people something on Earth now, so it works. And I tell you what, if you ever get despite, my love for cute little pet mice that I get at the pet store, I'm not fond of the ones that sneak in the house. They like to start a family. They're very family-oriented, and anyway. But believe it or not, sexual reproduction is a very inefficient process. It's a successful process, but it's very inefficient. Asexual reproduction, like bacteria, is far more efficient. So if something were going to get favored by natural selection, it wouldn't be male and female and this incredibly complex system that we have. Okay? Think about that. To come up with male and female humans, and I know there have been plenty of books written about this. I know both genders sometimes think the other one is just stark raving crazy, but irresistible nonetheless. Okay? But think about this, the complexity of male and female, the incredible complexity of reproductive anatomy and physiology and even behavior, okay? How in the world are you going to get that to develop? But keep in mind, if evolution were true, the male and the female had to both randomly evolve in perfect synchronization. You had to evolve not just one human, you had to evolve a male human and a female human, and they both had to survive, et cetera, et cetera. So now you've not just doubled the complexity of the problem, it's far more than that. All right, that's just, there are plenty of others. Think about a bird. You'll sometimes, there was an old expression like bird brain. Somebody who's not too bright, Hey, bird brain. Well, guess what? Bird brain is amazingly complex. Think about birds. I don't know if you ever thought about this. And I don't know if you've ever seen a Boeing 747 that can find its own fuel, repair itself from most injuries, and reproduce the next generation of them, etc. Vertical takeoff and landing, maybe even in water, etc. And mobile, both in the air, on the ground. You get the picture? There's pretty good complexity there. But think about this. You ever see a bird in flight? Even what even the what I call parking lot birds, or French fry birds, etc. They're out there by the millions. Take a look in wonder the next time you see one, much less some huge majestic bird just cruising up there. Don't you wish? Don't you just wish you could just float up there like that and ride the currents? Okay, but take a look. Think about this. They not only would have had to evolve all of the anatomy to do that, and I mean to perfection. Where do you think the design for the first airplane came from? It didn't come strictly out of a human mind. They were watching a bird. Okay, perfect anatomy for that, but you gotta know how to turn those wings and when to spread them and when to flap them and how to, you see what I mean? How to make a turn, how to spot something you want to eat from 500 feet in the air and get it. Or if you ever watch them go fishing, if you're at the beach, I mean, amazing. So you would have to evolve the anatomy and all of the software to use that anatomy, and they have to happen simultaneously because neither one's any good without the other. All right, there's all kinds, those are just a couple of examples, simple stuff. But I hope it makes a point. But there's all kinds of far, far, far more complicated things. Some of you, if you've ever worked in medicine and especially endocrinology, you know about the action of enzymes and hormones, but rarely is there just one thyroid hormone. No, instead there's also thyroid releasing hormone and thyroid stimulating hormone, okay, and that's just one. And they all work in these very, very complex, like double feedback control loops, etc. Okay? You don't get that by accident. The coagulation cascade, so that your blood stays liquid when you need it to be liquid, but is able to turn solid real quickly when you cut yourself and you need to, plug up an injury real quick. There are at least 10 enzymes involved in the sequence that makes that happen. and every one of them is useless without the others. So how do you evolve 10 different things at the same time, none of which have any function or any advantage, without all the others simultaneously in place? You know what the explanation is? Well, yeah, it probably just there was some other gene and it mutated and it just happened to fit into that coagulation cascade, and it happened again and again, and so yeah, it just whatever needed to happen happened, you know, kind of. Michael Behe came up with the idea of irreducible complexity, and that is that there are some things like that coagulation cascade. You can't get it any simpler. If you take out if you try to make it any less than those 10 interacting enzymes, below that it doesn't work at all. So when you find something that can't be made any simpler, then you have a hard time explaining how it evolved from something simpler. I think you get the picture there. And let me just send those around. You know, I'm going to try to read it right now. Although you might, anything to tune me out might be a welcome relief. But take a look at it later. And I do apologize. I realize I forgot to put the reference on there of the actual book that I lifted that from. But I would be happy to do that. There is this example. You want to talk about some complexity that's real hard to explain by anything other than careful design? You know, and they're always coming out with screens that are higher and higher resolution. That only matters because your eye has far higher resolution than anyone they've ever come out with yet. I mean, by far. See what I mean? You wouldn't be able to tell that it was higher resolution on the screen if your eye weren't far, far beyond that. I know Apple came out with what they called a few years ago the Retina display. Well, nice name, but not even close. Not even remotely close. I almost thought, hey, that's sacrilege, man. Don't you be calling that a Retina. It's good. It ain't $1,200 good. But anyway, as an aside, this year's Apple phones are almost as good as last year's Androids. I mean, and that's, yeah. Anyway, never mind. I give Apple credit for their marketing genius. They are absolutely genius, and their stuff does work. So, okay, anyway, away from my trivia and back to something useful here. And I'm not going to even get into this, but, you know, Darwin said, and you've got a quote at the top of your sheet there, he kind of said, yeah, I'll admit that the human eye, that's a real problem for my theory. Kind of absurd to think that could have happened, etc. Well, Richard Dawkins came back a few years ago in two of his books, The Blind Watchmaker and Climbing Mount Improbable, and he kind of said, well, yeah, it's not that hard. You know, it's not that hard. It could happen. He said, well, anyway, you'll see part of what he said there. He goes, you know, here's a few steps. The only problem he listed 5 steps, and it all sounded real good until you stop to think that there's about 10 million missing steps in between each of the 5 that he proposed. And you'll see just a little bit of that right there. And then, of course, keep in mind that if you could evolve an eye with its autofocus mechanism and its auto aperture mechanism, and do you know that it shifts to different receptors for low light vision, black and white, okay, and a whole different system for brighter light color vision? Okay, the whole unbelievable thing. Have you ever thought about whether you move your head because your eyes stay fixed exactly on the same thing even as you move your head? Even if you could evolve the eye, it would be useless without all of the muscles and the neural control mechanisms that gyrostabilize it, etc., and the mechanisms that allow you to understand what that nerve impulse meant. Okay, because there's a big difference between a neuron firing, giving an on or off signal, or saying, oh wow, that's a lily in bloom. Anyway, that one we could spend the next 10 weeks on. All right, so there are no reasonable evolutionary explanations for all kinds of things that are very, very useful to us, but don't give any survival advantage. See what I mean? So that wouldn't fit with evolutionary theory. The fact that you have eyebrows, you probably don't ever really think about that until you're out sweating working outside and realize that your eyebrows allow you to, wipe your sweat away every few minutes instead of 3 times every second and running into your eyes. There's no survival advantage necessarily, but that's pretty complex structure right there. Very, very useful. How about eyelashes, which serve a very useful function, but not necessarily a survival advantage? Wouldn't be enough for natural selection. How about sphincter muscles? Okay, sorry to be graphic here, folks. Do you enjoy the fact that mostly you can choose when you would like to go find a restroom? Now, if you make the mistake of eating at Crystal, that may be different, but, okay. But at any rate, or a few other places that sometimes we just can't resist now and then. Yeah, like the Nasty Dog combo over at Sam's or Costco and whatnot. But anyway, but for the most part, you and a number of other animals, you have the luxury of kind of saying, yeah, I'll find a restroom, 30 minutes from now. And what if you didn't have sphincter muscles? Then you don't get to make those choices, okay? Birds don't have them. All right. And they don't need them because it keeps their flight weight down, You can download whenever you need to, okay? And wherever. Sorry, folks. Might as well have a little fun. But in the human, the sphincter control mechanism, let's just say for urinary output, it's not just one, it's a double sphincter system. So that it gives you an indication of like, yeah, hey, sometime in the next little bit, you'll need to look for a facility. And then another one, which means you don't have to right this second, until finally it's like, yeah, right this second, okay? But that's because you have this incredible system, a double sphincter system. How do you get that if you're depending on random evolution? As I mentioned, color vision in ultra high definition, all kinds of things that strongly suggest design. I mean, they scream design, but even if they didn't, you cannot explain them with an evolutionary mechanism. So every area we look at really supports one conclusion. Evolution doesn't fit the evidence. And I don't just mean what we talked about today, I mean the last several weeks as well. In every way, if you look at it very critically, it just doesn't fit. I mean, even if there were no creator, even if you didn't have the hypothesis of a superior entity who may have designed and created, doesn't matter. Evolution just doesn't fit the evidence. So take any hypothesis you want, but this one doesn't work. From a purely rational, intellectual standpoint. The Darwinian hypothesis, let's see if it'll, yes. It's a very vague mechanism which we've seen doesn't work on a biological level. And we've seen from the fossil evidence and everything else, okay, the biology says that it shouldn't be able to happen. The fossil record says, yeah, sure enough, it didn't happen. Punctuated equilibrium, this idea that, yeah, somehow it happens all at once and then it stays the same. Well, that just acknowledges the reality of the missing evidence, but it doesn't do anything to explain it. It doesn't offer a mechanism for it. So the reality of it really is inescapable. The complexity and the precision of life that you see, just overwhelmingly indicative of design. Overwhelming. Even evolutionists will admit, yeah, you got to keep reminding yourself, it looks like design, but just remember it's not, because it would be tempting to think that it was designed. So just keep telling yourself it wasn't. Random mutations is just not a reasonable basis for it. So we didn't even get into the probabilities of it, because that's a whole nother discussion. So, I mean, you could conjecture as much as you want that it could happen, but there's just no evidence to support it, and everything argues against it from every direction. It didn't happen. And I say that respectfully, but I say that confidently to anybody. The evidence is missing, and the evidence contradicts it, and the mechanisms are missing. And the evidence that we do have in biology also contradicts it. It didn't happen by evolution. I don't say that disrespectfully. I don't say that to be condescending to anybody. I don't say that to be confrontational. I just say that looking for the truth. Go with whatever hypothesis you like, but it didn't happen that way. Well, there is a big problem with the evidence. So now what a lot of people are starting to suggest is, yeah, okay, just quit looking at the evidence. Quit talking about falsifying this theory. Okay, we just know it happened. Maybe we don't have it all worked out yet, but we all know it happened. Okay, there's no doubt about that unless you're just, as I put up Dawkins' quote, you're either stupid, ignorant, insane, or maybe wicked. He said that's what you'd have to be to not believe in evolution. Well, I'm sorry. Quite the opposite. But a lot of people are now starting to say, yeah, just quit. I don't want to hear about fossil record. We just know it happened somehow. That doesn't work for me. You're not convincing me of anything on a basis like that. Well, what about theistic evolution, though? Because as I mentioned to you, and there are a huge number of, you might say, scientists or, et cetera, who believe in something called theistic evolution. And that is to say, they have looked at this and they say, yeah, we don't think the universe came into existence without a creator somehow. And of course, none of us are ever going to understand that, but yeah, it looks that way. And then they say, yeah, the universe and the solar system, et cetera, it's all so finely tuned, et cetera. Yeah, that pretty much had to be some entity designed it that way and made it that way. And they may say, yeah, life arising from non-living material, and it just doesn't, and we talked about that, as you may remember, it just doesn't add up. There had to be a force that caused it to happen. But what we think happened is some entity created this and then just turned it loose as simple, primordial life, and then let it become this by evolution. So you get the idea. Okay, theistic evolution. Okay, so that deserves respectful attention, but I'm going to do that quickly. Now, ironically, this is really kind of the one area where most evolutionists and most creationists agree that that it wasn't theistic evolution, because most of the atheists will say, no, it can't be because there is no God. Most creation believers will say, no, it can't be because evolution's not true. But anyway, that's nothing but an interesting side point. Does it make sense? Well, theistic evolution, as we said, would solve a lot of those impossibilities. The problem is, the evolutionary theory, as we've seen, it's so riddled with fatal flaws that it doesn't really matter how it presumably started, it just doesn't work. Evolution doesn't work even if you do have a creator to put the first bacteria there. And I'll say this too. Now, again, in this very unusual study, we have not been relying on the Bible for our evidence. Very, very different from the way I usually teach a class. Very different. All right. But I will just say this. If you believe in the Bible, there are serious conflicts there. Now, there could be a creator without the Bible being true. That's a whole different discussion. But if the Bible is true, evolution cannot be, and vice versa. Because the Bible is very clear, even if you took the Genesis account, and even if you read it in the most broadly poetic, allegoric kind of way, even the most broadly. I'm not saying you should do that, I'm saying if you did, you still can't get it to fit with evolution, because even if you say, well, yeah, that day 3, that was, millions and millions of years, that's a whole separate discussion. It still doesn't work. Because the Bible says in Genesis, how did the woman come to be? And boy, aren't we all glad that the male and the female came to be, because we wouldn't be here otherwise. Plus, I'd sure hate to spend my life looking at a bunch of guys. But anyway, how does the Bible say that the male and the female came to be? How did the woman? Did she come along at the same time as the man? No. The man, it's very, very clear, if you believe the Bible, was fully formed, functioning, naming the animals, okay, before there was a woman at all. And then God made his final creation, by taking a rib. Here's another useless diversion. Some years ago, I was in an operating room one day, and I was actually harvesting a rib to make a nose out of it. And I mentioned to the anesthesiologist, I said, you do realize the rib harvest is the world's original surgical procedure. I said, so, clearly the creator must like surgeons. The anesthesiologist, he said, I'm afraid you're overlooking one big thing. He put him into a deep sleep first. He said, so that would be my profession. Anyway, all right. That was useless, but no extra charge for the trivia. All right. But you know the story. So the woman made from the man after he was fully formed. Now, the New Testament is also clear about this in several places, but one of them is in 1 Timothy. He's talking about some of the ways that we should conduct ourselves in the worship assembly, etc. And he mentions this. He said, because the man was formed first, then the woman. You can't get that with evolution, okay? So what I'm saying is, if evolution is true, those statements are an outright lie, and the Bible is false, if evolution is true. And if those statements are true, and the Bible valid in this respect, then evolution is an impossibility, theistic evolution or any other type. Does that make sense? Okay, because even if you try to read Genesis in the most broad way possible, there is a glaring contradiction between the Bible and evolution. Again, you could consider the idea that there could be a creator, but the Bible might not be true. So again, that's a whole separate, valuable discussion. Well, I'm going to skip right over this. A lot of people say, but hey, 99% of the world's scientists can't be wrong. Yeah, they can. Consensus is a vote. Okay, you may say, well, there's this overwhelming consensus for this. I'll just mention this. Here are some things that were the consensus. Bloodletting, how to determine if someone was a witch or not. Okay, there was a broad consensus for that at one time. The earth is flat. That was the consensus, and they'd kill you if you tried to say otherwise. The earth is the center of the universe. Several people went to their death for claiming that the earth was not the center of the universe, etc., etc. Oh, here's a popular one. Yeah, consensus on this, but all of a sudden it only happened within the last 3 or 4 years, and before that the consensus was that there seems to be male and female, etc. But now it's like, oh no, the consensus is there's multiple human genders. Yeah, consensus, real valuable thing. I won't go into a whole lot more, so I'm gonna skip over that. Consensus ain't science. A vote doesn't prove anything, especially when you're very selective about who you allow to vote. Okay, 99% of Catholics believe that the Pope is ordained by God. There's a strong consensus there, but they didn't let me vote. They didn't ask me. Okay, depends on who you ask, etc. Well, I'm going to, again, skip over of most of that. When the consensus agrees with the facts, it's great, but you didn't need it anyway. When the consensus contradicts the facts, well, then it's false. So it doesn't add anything either way. You may have heard of Michael Crichton. That's what he said about it. In science, consensus is irrelevant. Okay. Well, if you want to get my slides later, which I freely welcome you to do, then you can look at some more of these things to your heart's content. And I'm going to skip over some more stuff there. But I will say this again. Evolution just does not work. In any way you try to accept it, it just doesn't work. Now, you can't prove that there's a God. You can't run an experiment. You can't prove by human means that there is a God, but you can use your brain. Okay? Because for most of these things, you've got basically two competing hypotheses, one of which cannot possibly be true if you're using your brain at all. The other, which you can't prove, but it's overwhelmingly consistent with the evidence, the facts, and everything that we see. And I will say again, just my own little quote, where you see the noticeable appearance of design, you gotta give consideration to the idea it might have been designed. especially when the alternate theory makes no sense whatsoever. And again, I don't say that with any disrespect to anybody who believes that. But when you get down to it and you actually critically examine it, it falls apart. Even SETI is based on the premise that if you get some ordered information from somewhere, it probably came from an intelligent source, not a random star explosion somewhere. So why would we throw that principle out when we're talking about something as important as this? Francis Crick, one of the people who discovered DNA, 1952 and 53, said biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. It's kind of like, don't trust your eyes and the evidence that's right in front of you. Just keep reminding yourself, no, there is no designer. Even though the whole universe screams, yeah, this is designed. The final objection is this, and I'm not going to go into this either. Some people will say, well, okay, yeah, but the idea that there could be a God, a superior entity, that's not scientific. No, it's far beyond science. Yeah, it is. But it's not contradictory to science. It transcends the boundaries of science. And they say, well, it can't be falsified. I'm gonna have to skip over this, but I would love to tell you or let you see some slides about how that's not true anymore, because thanks to some of our evolutionary friends, they have suggested ways that, yeah, actually you could falsify the hypothesis of a designer. If you could find something that's clearly inconsistent with design, that would disprove it. And therefore it is worthy of consideration by anybody's definition. But some of the things that, pardon my, flying through these without covering for the reason I told you. But part of what's claimed as, a falsifying design really amounts to, well, that's not the way I would have done it, so therefore there's not a designer. Do you see the flaw in that? Yeah, if I tried to design an airplane or a race car with no more knowledge than I have right now, it might not be real great. You know why? Not because the guy who built it designed it wrong. No, it could be because he knows more than I do and I don't even realize that. Okay, anyway, you get the idea. So when you come down to evolution, if you can stick with me about 2 or 3 more minutes here. Here's our things. Punctuated equilibrium, like Dr. Gould said, it would make more sense than regular evolution, but there's no mechanism proposed for how it happened. And it all looks like creation, actually, by the fossil record. The typical evolutionary theory, you can't test it, it's not science, it's not observable, multiple fatal flaws, as we've said, and if it has multiple fatal flaws, you can't rely on it to explain anything. Creation, no, you can't test it, it's not science per se. You can't observe it because I wasn't there. I can read about it, but I wasn't there. But it is compatible with the evidence that we see in the universe and the world with no actual conflicts. It is the only currently available theory that actually would fit perfectly as an explanation for everything. So when you go back to the 4 questions that we started with, in each case, as we've gone through these things, I hope in a logical way, they all fall apart. Now, I'll consider any hypothesis you want to put in front of me. In fact, I'll enjoy considering it. And if somebody comes up with a new one, I'll be eager to look at that. But so far, this is the only one that actually survives the test. And the question then is going to be, again, my cheesy acronym that I was just so pleased with myself for thinking up. Are you willing to get honest with the science? Not just the consensus, but the actual science? Are you willing to get honest with the evidence that is and is not available to us? Are you willing to get honest with the logic and realize what's fact? Are you willing to get honest with yourself on these major questions? And it comes back to exactly where we started. Everybody needs to consider these questions. Is there a superior entity? Does it really make sense to believe any way you approach it. Not just because I want to believe it, not because my parents taught me that, not because my beloved 4-year-old, when I was 4, Sunday school teacher, not for any of that, not because it makes me feel good, because it makes perfect sense. And no other explanation makes any sense when you start rationally examining. Well, that would lead us to the next question. If there is this superior entity, do we have any communication available to us? Has this entity actually spoken to us? Well, then that would become an important question, wouldn't it? The answer to the first question, I think, is an emphatic yes. And that question is one, then, that we really owe it to ourselves to consider. And there's my nerd flow chart that I said at the beginning. Is there a God? Oh, I think the answer is absolutely, overwhelmingly yes. So there's the next question. Has he communicated with humans? Well, I hope you'll take a look at that. And what you say is probably, thank goodness, it's over. Folks, thank you for being here. If you disagree, I would love to hear from you. If you want to know, okay, what was some of that stuff you skipped over, whatever, I would love to talk to you. I would love it. And you can disagree with me all day long. And I will be wanting to learn something from you, okay? So thank you for your attention. You have been so far beyond kind. You have been very encouraging. If nothing else, I hope when somebody tells you, I was like, yeah, science has proved there's no God. I hope, if nothing else, that you are confident enough to respectfully say, oh no, wait a minute. I think you may need to take a much closer look at the science. Thank you, folks. If I could share one of these devotional reading books with you, please come see me. I would just love, because I need to empty that box, just so I don't throw my back out. So, when you're 400 years old, you got to live in fear. Thanks, y'all. Okay, will do. Could you maybe bring me a flash drive like that? The file's too big to email. But yeah. Thanks, Tim. Yes, sir. Thank you, brother.
I read through, I'm just about to finish your devotional book that you gave me from last week. I'd love to have one.
Great job.
Thank you, Tim. I really, thanks for your support all the way. If you don't mind peeling this here's the gift wrapping. Let's remove the gift wrapping.
Merry Christmas to you.
Yes, and to you, brother. Thinking for you and me and Tyler. We got a ton going on with my mom's affairs and whatnot. Could we maybe think we're late January?
Sure.
Okay, because I'm looking forward to that. Me too. I mean, no agenda except just sit down and enjoy it. Okay, good deal. Hey.
Great job.
Thank you, brother. Well, you have been so encouraging. Hey, did you take
I will.
Okay.
I'll share it. Okay.
Okay, now that's the one for men. Do you tell her to choose one of these two? They're similar, but they're, tell her to come look at you. Okay. All right, good deal.
I appreciate it. Okay.
Yes, sir. Look forward to many, many years together. Hey, brother.
I was thinking about something last 2 weeks about something that was really good for people to kind of see that would wrap that up really well. I thought is there are 5 different substratas of probability that has to happen. Yes. Is that the genetic mutation needs to be positive. Yes. Secondly, it needs to be transferable in the population. Third, it needs to be replicatable or
reproducible and predominating.
And it needs to be in the perfect context that the should work.
Yes.
All those are all multiplied. So it's like if you have I think a file, a subset.
You always wear the best dress.
I think that would be like if you just had little index thing, that would be lights out.
That's a great idea. And that kind of gets into some of that.
I don't know, something
the mathematical probabilities of it. Yeah, which I didn't even go into, but they're overwhelming.
I know, I wanted the math.
Yeah. I was going to say that the math will blow you away. I didn't include it just to kind of keep things simpler. What you're both talking about, the mathematics of the biology are just unbelievable.
Yeah.
Also, I want a devotional.
Yes. Okay. All right. And would you guys actually share an apartment, don't you?
We do.
Could I let you guys perhaps share one?
Share one, yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
And yeah, there's the gift wrapping. Sorry about that. Okay. Ladies, there are two. They're similar, but they're a little different.
Zip one.
Love to see it.
Yes, you may. Which would you? Oh, wait, no, that's the zipper one.
Get back with you.
Okay.
Being a strong one. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I need that.
Thank you.
I'm just not a good one at all, Olivia. Yes, you're welcome. What you got here, Steve? You guys looking for one? Yes. I'll take one of the feminine books. You guys won't go with the house, right?
Yeah, we can take one.
Can I let you share? Yeah, there's your gift wrap. Sorry.
Oh, that's fine.
Okay, anyway. Yeah, it's, now again, you may find some things in there that may not be scriptural. It's by denominational author, collection of authors, some great stuff. I think you'll like it. To me, it's just focuses on thinking on something. Still going? Oh, yeah, it's a good point.